welcome to all of you. As I was getting ready to walk up to the stand, my husband reminded me that I was one of the survivors of girls' camp this year, and he concluded that if I could survive girls' camp, I could survive speaking in the Marriott Center. I trust that it is so. It's almost like speaking in the Grand Canyon here of the BYU campus. My name is Susan Black. I've been a professor of church history and doctrine at this university. I've taught here now for the last 20 years. I'm now an associate dean of general education and honors. In reality, it is a pleasure for me to speak to you about the topic that I have been given today, and the topic is the mantle of the prophet. As I talk today, I'll be talking about the succession of the presidency of the church, particularly after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was leader of our church from 1830 until his death in 1844. During the years that the prophet Joseph led the church, there were 9 different men that formed what are called break-off churches from our church. The first one was formed in the year 1831 by a man named Wycombe Clark. He had the audacity to call his church the Pure Church of Christ. There were other men that broke off after Wycombe Clark, such people as Warren Parrish, who formed a church called the Church of Christ. Also, there was another man whose name was George Hinkle. He formed a church called the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bride of the Lamb's Wife. And then last but not least, in 1844, William Law formed a church that was most commonly referred to but by such an outstanding name as merely the church. Well, with all of these various break-off churches that formed during the lifetime of Joseph, if you were to say, are any of them still in existence upon the earth? The answer is no. Since Christ has not come in a millennial reign, then what we must conclude is that these churches that broke off from the church that Joseph was so strongly a part of, therefore these churches cannot possibly be true. After all, you may recall, as Daniel was interpreting the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, he talked about that there would be a stone that would be cut out without hands from a mountain, and that it would roll forth until it filled the whole earth. Obviously, then, these 9 break-off churches that had their formation between 1831 and 44, since they have not lasted the test of time, therefore, they could not have been true. But the question arises, but what about after the death of Joseph Smith? After the death of Joseph Smith, we can name 18 different men that formed a church between the death of Joseph Smith and the death of President Brigham Young. Now, what about those churches? Are there any still in existence today? The answer is yes. This hour we're going to view some of those churches that gained a different name than a break-off church. They were called a splinter church, meaning something to the effect as if you had a tree and you were to have parts of it fall off, then it just becomes splinters. None of them became huge groups, but they are merely a splinter from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I take you now to Carthage on June 27, 1844. About 5 p.m. in the evening, Joseph Smith, his brother, who is also considered a prophet, Hiram Smith, John Taylor, an apostle, and Willard Richards were in the second story of what has become known to be called the Carthage jail. As a martyrdom occurred, Joseph died, Hiram died. John Taylor was severely wounded as 4 bullets entered his body, but 1 bullet aimed for his heart, you may recall, was miraculously stopped by a watch. For Willard Richards, he had a bullet that passed through his right earlobe. As Willard Richards now penned a message back to Nauvoo, he announced in that message that the prophet Joseph was dead, Hiram was dead, that John Taylor was wounded, and that Willard Richards was giving his word that the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo would not retaliate against the community of Carthage or other areas in Illinois. The Saints did not retaliate, but there's no question they mourned their loss. As the bodies of Joseph and Hiram were brought back to Nauvoo, the Saints literally lined Parley Street to pay their tribute to the two fallen martyrs. After that, they then went through the home viewing these men. There was a mock funeral, and finally the question on the street was, who will be our leader? In other words, they had had choices that obviously they could have made from the original 9 break-off groups. Those in Nauvoo who had remained faithful didn't fall with the winds of doctrine that were pounding against them during those early years. But now, without Joseph Smith to guide them, there was a question as to who would be the leader. Now, as they stood after the funeral and for weeks on the streets of Nauvoo, the thought in many people's mind was there was no longer a church, that it was all over. It was a wonderful dream. The people had thought that Joseph Smith was like a John the Baptist and Elias, and that he would live to hand the keys to Christ, who would come rule in a millennial reign. But when the millennium didn't happen during Joseph's lifetime, their feeling was, it's all over. As people stood on those street corners, they began to talk one to another about where they would go now they were no longer a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some talked about their land that they had in Missouri that they had abandoned during the extermination order. Some talked about returning back to Missouri, for after all, everything grows in Missouri. Others talked about going all the way back to Kirtland, Ohio. They had remembered those glorious days when the temple was dedicated and all of the events surrounding their sacrifice to build the beautiful edifice. Some talked of going there. Still others talked of returning back to New York, such places of origin as Palmyra, Fayette, and Colesville. Others planned on returning to England. In England, many of the saints, as they got word that Joseph was dead, they also thought there wasn't a church anymore. One particular branch actually draped their sacrament table in black in remembrance of the one-time experience when they knew a prophet of God had been upon the earth. You can imagine that there's literally chaos on the streets of Nauvoo. Well, where are the general authorities? 10 members of the Quorum of the 12 are serving missions in the 26 United States and in the one territory of Iowa. Then you look and you say, but what about the other 2 in Nauvoo? John Taylor is extremely ill from the experience that he has had in Carthage jail with the bullets that have entered his body. Willard Richards, who always liked to be referred to as Dr. Richards because of the few weeks he had actually attended a medical type school, Dr. Willard Richards now feels that his responsibility is to keep John Taylor alive. So rather than talking to the people on the streets of Nauvoo and assuring them all is well, he views his responsibility as to keep John Taylor alive. When his medical experience fails him, many blessings are given to John. Willard Richards believes that as 2 died, 2 must live to witness that they were there and they had seen the same. Well, amidst all this chaos, we turn our attention now to one man who formed a break-off church, or what are now called splinter churches, that is still in existence today. His name is Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, you